Alrighty, hey guys, just want to check and make sure we're actually streaming. It should be. Oops. Yes, we are. Alright, so first thing we are going to be going over today um, is introductions. Although, as you can see, we're going to focus in on Daniel. And I want to get this up. Sorry, I was prepared, and for some reason it's being stupid. There we go. Okay, sorry about that. So, introductions. Now, last time we met 2 weeks ago, we ended up going over Samuel and Kings and Chronicles, and mostly talk about David and Solomon and the separating of the kingdoms. And so I figured I would start with the introductions on books that they had a big part in, that is King David and King Solomon. So starting with Psalms, it's the largest collection of ancient poetry in existence. There are several authors, including David and Solomon. There's also Asaph, the sons of Korah, Haman, even one from Moses, and one from Ethan the Ezrahite. I got all that information off of gotquestions.org. So if you want to look at how many are from each author, you can go on their website and find that link. About a third of them, a little bit less, are anonymous, so we're not certain who wrote them. I'm sure we could take some guesses maybe, but um, anyway. The Psalms, they're kind of like our hymn books, although I know a lot of churches today don't actually have hymn books anymore. Um, so for those of you who maybe haven't been to an older church or go to a church that has hymn books are basically song books. Now, our hymn books have sheet music in them, which I always enjoyed reading and singing growing up, but some people today don't. So, and obviously these Psalms don't have any musical notes in them that we know of. Maybe there was something along the lines. Some of them do say play to the melody of this or the melody of that. And so I'm sure that the Israelites would have had them pretty well memorized. Some of them are praises, others are laments. So that is, some are happy, some are sad. And it gives us a full range of emotions from the people of God. And so if you're in a happy place and you want something to express that, you can find it in the Psalms. If you are just as low as you could possibly be, you can find some inspiration in the Psalms. Something that will show you that other people have been in low situations as well, and God has gotten them through. The next book, which there are several things I'm going to be introducing, by the way, just so that those who don't really know the Bible can have a better idea of where all of these fit in. But the next book is the book of Proverbs. And this is a collection of wisdom sayings. Some of them are short couplets, some of them are actually long poems. And typically, we'll say that Solomon wrote the book of Proverbs, though it may be that while he was the wisest man, because he asked God for wisdom and God made him the wisest, he may not have written all of them. He may have collected them. And obviously, I believe that God would have um, inspired him and anyone else who may have had some input on the book of Proverbs to put in only those proverbs that would have been good for God's people to read and keep in mind. So when interpreting the Psalms or the Proverbs, sorry, you need to not forget the nature of a proverb. It's not, an absolute truth. Do this, don't do that. No, it's a general sense of truth that is normally correct. You know, um, for instance, it talks about how the righteous will have long lives, or if you live a certain way, you'll have a long life, and that death comes quickly to the wicked. It's not always true, you know. Sometimes, yes, the wicked end up doing very stupid things that kills them early, or you know, but even especially in today's society, a lot of the people that we would consider wicked tend to stick around for a while. So, Ecclesiastes is another book that we believe was that we believe Solomon was the author, though there are people who debate that and they kind of give it a later dating. Um, Something I read said that the author of Ecclesiastes had to have been familiar with certain Egyptian and Mesopotamian writings from before the time of Solomon, but that they didn't use anything from the like Greco-Roman period, possibly even the Medo-Persian period, that a lot of people try to put this into, and that it was written in those time periods, those later time periods, but it doesn't seem to be familiar with those, but it is really familiar with things that are from before Solomon's time. Also, some people, some of the people who read the Bible, especially when they get to this book, they don't um, really like the attitude that the author has, or that the author's portraying anyway. And so some people will say that, well, this book can't be authentic because of these things, and I've listed some of them here on the PowerPoint, with everything being futile in chapter 1, verse 2. He seems to deny that there's an afterlife in chapter 3, recommends basically partying, eat, drink, and be merry in chapters 5 and 10. And he seems to be indifferent about morality in chapter 7. But what I see here when I read Ecclesiastes and I take it all into account, I see someone who has done these things. He's lived life, and he's realized, looking back on it now, because he's an older gentleman, and if it was Solomon, it was most likely written towards the end of his life. It's he sees just how futile life really is, even though he's enjoyed a lot of things. Without Yahweh, without God, it's really been futile. And I quoted chapter 12, verses 13 to 14 there, the last couple of verses in the book. When all has been heard, the conclusion of the matter is, fear God and keep his commands, because this is for all humanity. For God will bring every act to judgment, including every hidden thing, whether good or evil. And so to me, this book basically says, without God, life is nothing. There's no value. It doesn't mean anything. You may as well do what you want because you're going to die tomorrow, and that's it. That's what the book is saying, and I think that atheism really holds on tight to the lifestyle that this book talks about, um, except for the last little part, obviously. Next is a Song of Songs. It's also called the Song of Solomon, or Canticles. I think that's how you pronounce that. I've never actually seen it called that, except for in lists where it says Song of Psalms, also known as. I think that might be in the Catholic Bibles. I'm not entirely certain. Again, I've never seen it, and I've used several different English translations. So most scholars agree that Solomon wrote this book, though there are a few who would doubt that. Obviously, there's always going to be a few who doubt anything and everything. So this is a book that you may not want to read with your kids. You may not want to let them read it until they're a certain age, because it talks a lot about what a husband and wife do. This has a bridegroom and a bride, and they're talking about their love for one another. And when you keep it in the context of a marriage poem, it really is a beautiful poem, and it is something. Um, Granted, it's dated, um, but I think you could take the dialogue and the metaphors and update them in a way that would, you know, keep to the original, but also still be the beautiful poem that this obviously was back in its day, and I think still is, even though it's dated. When you're interpreting this book, you want to be careful. Some schools tend to allegorize it a lot, others tend to take it a little bit more literally. I think a middle of the road approach is really meant, um, because I can see in the Bible where God talks about his people, whether Israel or the church, as his bride, and he is the bridegroom and all of this, and so I can see the allegory there, and I think that's good. But I also do think that this may have been something that Solomon wrote for one of his wives when they were getting married. Um, I think it was on Got Questions Again, or maybe it was in my study Bibles, um, where they said that it matches, not exactly obviously, but it is very similar to other marital ceremony type things that have been found in the Mesopotamian area. Next is the minor prophets, and I'm kind of lumping them all together just because it's all basically, well, I'm not going to say it's all basically the same. It's just easier for me to lump it together and keep it short. I am planning on doing some videos and blogs for each individual book of the Bible, all 66 of them, and I can do a much better, more thorough job there. Now, for the minor prophets, we got Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Now, they're not minor prophets because they're less important. They're considered minor prophets because their books are so short, although a couple of them are as long as Daniel, which wasn't on this list here. It's on the major prophets list. Um, but typically their books are short, and typically their influence, the message that, the audience that their message was meant for, was a very specific group of people, or even a specific city, or just had to deal with a specific event. Uh, so that's why they're the minor prophets. And I want to talk a little bit about Malachi. Malachi was the last book of the Bible written about 425 BC, and it was followed by a little over 400 years of silence until the time of John the Baptist, and that is something that I believe Joel prophesied about the silence that would come. To be honest, I'll have to look that up, but or you could probably Google it too. I'll look it up also. Excuse me. But basically, from Malachi to John the Baptist, God was silent in Israel. There weren't any prophets. There weren't any messages to anybody, at least not in Israel. Um, and again, that's just fulfilling God's word. This doesn't take into account, of course, the apocryphal books, which are books that um, claim in some way, shape, or form to be inspired. Um, Another term is pseudepigrapha, although that's a specific type. That would be a book that claims to be authored by somebody that it definitely wasn't authored by. And you can tell this by the facts of history they get wrong and the wording that they use and certain other things. Things that if you do those to the books of the Bible, you find them to be true. So, some of the apocryphal books are historical. For example, there's actually 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Maccabees. 1st and 2nd Maccabees are historical. They're accurate, but they were never considered inspired scripture, and therefore they were never in the Jewish canon, and therefore they're never in our canon either. They are in the Catholic Bible, if I remember correctly. 3rd and 4th Maccabees, I believe, are considered to be completely false, possibly the pseudepigrapha, and I don't think they're in the Catholic Bible. They might be, but I don't think they are. And I don't know of anybody that uses them, at least no one anywhere near mainstream. So the next set would be the major prophets, which would be Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, which was written by Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel. Now, one thing I would suggest, don't read Jeremiah and Lamentations back to back. It can be rather depressing. Matter of fact, I would recommend mixing it up. Read a couple chapters of Jeremiah, read something else, read something from Lamentation, a couple chapters from Lamentations, read something else, just to keep the lightheartedness up. Now, they're called the major prophets because their books are typically much longer, especially Isaiah and Jeremiah. And their books also have an impact that is a much larger, you know, impact than the minor prophets did. It got out to more people. It was meant for more people. Um, it dealt with nations instead of just cities and that kind of thing. It's not because God liked them better or they were better at speaking or whatever. It just means that, God gave them a larger message and a lot more to write. Now, unfortunately, all of the prophets, both major and minor, are overlooked by the everyday Christian. And what I mean by that is someone who doesn't daily read their Bible. Someone who comes to church on Sundays, hears the message, maybe they meet with their church family throughout the week, or just, some friends that happen to go to the same church, but they don't do anything church-wise, um, which only about 20 to 25% of Christians actually read their Bible daily, which is sad. Of course, the reason why some people overlook it, maybe even part of that 25%, would be because of the prophetic language. It's kind of hard to understand sometimes. Not always, but sometimes. You'll see some examples in Daniel when I read them. Also, all the warnings and condemnation for not following God. Nobody really likes to hear the fire and brimstone, right? But we do need both. We need the good news, we need the bad news, we need uplifting sermons, we need fire and brimstone sermons. We can't swing one way or the other too far. We need to be in the middle there. Without giving too much detail, I do want to give a basic time frame for all the prophets. I'm not going to say which one was first and which one was last, although I did just say that Malachi was last. But depending on the prophet, of course, some of them are like right before Assyria came in and conquered the northern kingdom of Israel. And then some of them are during that time, and then some when the Babylonians come in and take over the southern kingdom of Judah, which of course, they would have been right before then too. And then during that whole thing, and then a few of them are shortly after that, and when the Israelites are coming back into Jerusalem to rebuild it and get their nation up and running again. I would suggest getting a study Bible with introductions to each of the books, just as something to go through. And again, I'll be doing introductions as well at some point in time, probably after I'm done with this whole series. So, don't hold your breath waiting for it. And also, GotQuestions.org has introductions to the books as well, which is free, so you don't have to buy another Bible, and it's very good. There's just a few more books that I need to touch on, and then we'll get to Daniel. And those books are Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. Now, Ezra and Nehemiah were originally one book in the Hebrew, and they were probably written by the same author. Traditionally, it's Ezra who wrote both of them, and obviously hard evidence for this is kind of hard to come by, but both of the books deal with the Jews returning to Jerusalem after the Babylonian captivity. They both have a few different things going on, of course. They're not carbon copies of each other. Esther, it may have been written by Ezra or Nehemiah, or it may have been written by Mordecai, who is one of the major characters in the book of Esther. And the book itself shows God's providence and how he provides for his people, even through a foreign king and with people really just hating them. Because there was a guy who wanted to kill all the Jews because he actually hated Mordecai so much. But Esther, who was a Jewess, managed to get into the king's harem and become his wife. Actually ended up becoming his number one wife, and she was able to get his ear and tell him what was going on, and that she would be one of the people killed by an edict that he actually did put out. And he made another edict saying that the Jews could protect themselves, and they did. So, with that, we shall get into Daniel. And Daniel, well, we will see, was always loyal to God, at least as far as what we have in the Bible. And I don't see any reason why he wouldn't have been outside the Bible as well. Although it is possible. He is human, or was. Now, for Daniel's life, around 605 BC, when he was a young man, in his teens, he and his friends were taken to Babylon, and they were put into a program that was going to train them to be advisors in the king's court. His friends were Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Most of you may know them better as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Now, um, he and his friends, they did want to stay true to Yahweh because Yahweh was their God. And when they were given the king's food, they turned it down. I'm guessing because it was unclean to some degree. Go back. I don't want to get there just yet. He asked their, well, for lack of a better term, handler, the guy that was in charge of them, he asked if they could have just water and vegetables. And the guy was like, well, if you end up being, weaker and scrawnier than everyone else, it's going to be in my head. And Daniel said, well, test us for a bit and see what happens. And so after 10 days of just water and vegetables, the guy looked at him and looked at the other boys that were being trained as well. And he said, well, you look healthier than these guys. And they may have even changed the other guy's diet. I'm not entirely sure on that one. About a year later, King Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had a dream. And he wouldn't tell any of his advisors what the dream was. He wanted them to tell him what it was and what it meant. Of course, no one had ever done this before, and they were like, well, just tell us. And he was like, no. I guess he was smart enough to realize that if they really were interpreters and um, you know, priests, mediums, sorcerers, diviners, Chaldeans, they could tell him what it was and what it meant. But they couldn't, and he was going to kill them all. Daniel heard about this, and he said that he could interpret it, and he just needed some time to pray to God. And so he and his friends, they prayed to Yahweh, and he went and told Nebuchadnezzar what the dream was. Now, what it was the statue here. Now, it may not have looked exactly like that, but it did have a gold head, had a silver arms and torso, bronze waist and thighs, iron legs, and feet made of iron and miry clay mixed. And the interpretation of this was that these were all kingdoms. You had Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom, Babylon, which was the best. After that was a second kingdom, which I don't have on this list here. I didn't see that in the picture. But this was going to be the Medo-Persian Empire. Now, Daniel didn't say this. He just said another kingdom, another kingdom, another kingdom. Looking back on history, we can see what these kingdoms were. So this kingdom was Medo-Persia. After that, there would be another kingdom that would rule the world. And now this one here says the Persian Empire. This one does have some empires on it. Interesting. I think that was actually the Greek Empire. And then the iron legs would have been the Roman Empire. And then the feet mixed with miry clay would have been the divided Roman Empire. Now, the next part of the dream, which you don't see in the picture here, there is a stone hewn out of the mountain as without human hands, and it comes and it crushes the statue. It hits it at its feet, knocks it over, and crushes it. And then it grows into this huge mountain and fills the whole earth. Now that, Daniel says, is God's kingdom. And so we would know that that is the kingdom the Messiah was going to set up. And that comes into play later on in our talk. Now, about a couple decades later, Nebuchadnezzar built this huge statue of himself, 90 foot tall, 30 cubits, some of your Bibles might say. And he ordered everyone to worship it. I kind of wonder if this wasn't brought on by the dream, but who knows. Now, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they refused to bow down when the music was played, because everyone was supposed to bow down towards the statue when all these instruments played. We're not sure where Daniel was. He was probably off doing some advisory thing, I think. I don't think he was out there on the plane. Maybe he was, but the Bible doesn't say one way or the other. So now, since they refused to, Nebuchadnezzar, he gave them a second chance, but he told them that he was going to throw them into the fiery furnace if they didn't bow down and worship. And they didn't. They refused. They said, "Oh, king, it doesn't matter. Our God will save us, but even if he doesn't, we don't care. We're not going to bow down and worship this thing." So Nebuchadnezzar ordered that the fire be 7 times hotter than normal. And then he had them tied up, He had his guards throw them in. The guards died because it was so hot. But Nebuchadnezzar looks in and he sees Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego walking around in the fire. So the ropes are burned off. They're walking around, and he sees a fourth person. He says that looks like one of the gods, or a son of the gods. Different translations will say different things there. I believe that it was the pre-incarnate Christ, the angel of Yahweh, um, you know, God the Son, manifesting here on earth, walking around with them. And he calls out, come out, and they didn't even smell like smoke. And he said, everyone's going to worship the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So, what are some things we can learn from here? Firstly, is that God has his plans, and he will reveal them to whomever he chooses and for his purposes. And of course, he will bring someone to interpret the method with which he revealed his plans if necessary. Also, we should be willing to follow God no matter the consequences, like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were. I'm not saying that you need to go out and get yourself killed um, by any means. I don't think that we should all search for martyrdom. Matter of fact, I don't think that you should search for martyrdom, but I think that you should take a stand for what you believe, even if you know it's going to end up getting you killed. Now, to a degree, maybe some should go off and be safe, and others should stay and get killed, because God still needs his message to be there. He needs his witnesses, not the Jehovah's Witnesses, that's a cult, but he needs true believers to be there to witness to people for him. But I do think that you should stand up like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did for their beliefs. They didn't have a chance to run away, and they knew it, and they decided to stand with God. And after this, Nebuchadnezzar has another dream. It's about this big, huge tree, and then it gets chopped down. And Daniel says that it's about Nebuchadnezzar, that he's been made so great, but it's because God has done it, not because he's done it himself. And if he doesn't start acknowledging God, then he's going to go crazy, walk around like an animal for a while. And that's what happens. Nebuchadnezzar doesn't heed the dream, and he pays the price. He ends up going crazy and living like a wild animal for, I think, 7 years or so. And that was God, telling him, "Hey, don't be haughty with me. I'm not done with you yet, so I'm just going to punish you." And after Nebuchadnezzar gets better and comes back, Belshazzar, who I believe is his grandson, takes over. And he angered God in about 540 BC. 539 is what I have on the slide there, and that's probably the correct date. He was throwing a party, and he decides that he's going to get the plates and cups and saucers and everything that came from the temple in Jerusalem, Yahweh's temple, and he's going to eat off of them and drink out of them. And God doesn't like that. So a hand shows up, and it writes, oh, if I could remember what it wrote. No. Mene Mene Tekel Upharsin, I believe is what it is. Or is it Tekel Tekel Mene Upharsin? Let me look that up real quick. Got a marker that's pretty close to that section. Yeah, Mene Mene Tekel Upharsin. Now your Bible probably just says Mene Mene Tekel Parsin. The U is and. And I should have left it there. Because basically, no one knows how to interpret it, and then someone says, well, there's that really old guy, a good advisor, your granddad liked him a lot, Daniel, why don't he can say what it is, bring him in. And so it says this, Mene means that God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. And he said that twice, so it's definitely going to happen. That's like in Genesis where it says, you will surely die. If you want to do that literally, it says a death you will die. And that's just saying, it's for certain. It's done. No ifs, ands, or buts. You're done. Tekel means that you have been weighed in the balance and found deficient or found wanting. And then Parasin, Paris, means that your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and Persians, which would be the Medo-Persian Empire, the silver torso, at least as I interpret it. As the picture showed, I think that was the thighs. And I guess I could see both. I'll have to look into that and decide which one I really think it is. Um, I think both have their merits, though, so I may not get around to choosing. Now, Daniel was rewarded for this, of course. Now, later on, God does give the kingdom over to the Medo Persian Empire, and Darius is the ruler. He planned to put Daniel in charge of basically everyone but himself, second in command, kind of like Joseph was in Egypt. Daniel was one of three administrators, and they were going to be over these 120 satraps, I believe it calls them. Daniel's fellow administrators didn't like that Daniel was going to be over them, and they didn't like Daniel either, really. He was a nice guy and everything, they just didn't like him. So they made a plan to trap him. And basically, what it was, they went to Darius and they said, "Why don't you make a decree where for 30 days no one can pray to any god but you?" Because, back then, kings tried to label themselves as gods and be worshipped, which I think is where ancestor worship came from, which is probably where a lot of the other pantheon of gods came from. I think they were real people that got deified. Not that they actually had the powers that the stories talk about, but that came later on with legends and myths and whatnot. Um, but now this wouldn't have been a problem for just about anybody else because everyone else is like, well, yeah, there's these other gods. In 30 days, the other god I normally worship will understand. But not with Daniel, and not with other Israelites that I'm sure also um, did not keep the edict. But Daniel, he didn't just pray to God, even though he wasn't supposed to, according to the law, man's law, not God's law. God's law always overrides man's law. Daniel still prayed to Yahweh, and he did it with his windows open. He did it openly. And the administrators knew this, and so during the time they went and they saw and they caught him and they brought him to Darius. I don't know if they brought him to Darius, but they told Darius, "Hey, remember that edict you wrote where everyone's supposed to pray to you? Well, Daniel broke it. And of course, the law can't be unbroken. The law can't be undone. You can't make any exceptions. That's just the way the Medo-Persians did it. When the king made an edict and stamped it, it was done. It couldn't be repealed. And if it had a time frame, then obviously it had a time frame. But otherwise, it couldn't be repealed. There weren't any exceptions. Nothing. Of course, Darius is upset about this, not because he's angry with Daniel, but because he likes Daniel. Daniel is, his number one guy, and he's a really good friend too. You know, um, but he says, the law is the law. So he takes Daniel, who was an old man at this time, as you can kind of see in the picture there. Obviously, that's not an actual picture of Daniel, but that depicts him pretty well as an old man. And he puts him in the lion's den. Now, exactly, was it kind of a dungeon-esque thing like this? Was it a pit? I don't know, but it was something that they could shut him into and lock him into. And he leaves him there for the night. Of course, he says he's sorry, but Daniel's like, "It's okay. God will save me or he won't." And God saves him. That morning, the next morning, Darius wakes up and um, he's worried. He runs to the lion's den. He hollers in, "Daniel, are you okay? Did your God save you?" And Daniel says, "Yeah, he sent his angel and closed the mouths of the lions." And so he opens up the door, lets Daniel out. He's so grateful. He takes the other advisors. He says, "I know what you did. For that, you're being punished." And them and their families were thrown to the lion's den. And the lions must have been hungry because they barely made it in the door when the lions ate them. Or didn't even hit the floor before the lions ate them, as some translations say. So what can we learn from this? First of all, don't test God's limits like Nebuchadnezzar did. and Belshazzar. If God gives you a warning, heed it. And if you know that this is sacred, don't mess with it. Of course, Belshazzar probably thought, well, my God's better than Yahweh. Um, Today we know that, well, at least us Christians know, just like the ancient Israelites knew that Yahweh is the only true God, the only God, period. All others are, maybe strong um, spiritual beings, but that's it. And even then, they're just, playing up the God type. I do think that demons do that every now and again, at least. Also, don't try and trap God's servants. And if you're a servant of God and you feel like you're being trapped, well, keep following God, keep serving Him. He will reward you for it in some way, shape, or form, either here or the next life. So that is the first half of the book of Daniel. The second half are a lot of prophecies, a couple of which I want to go over a little bit in this study, which we're almost done with. So the main prophecies got the four beasts, which represent the four kingdoms, much like the statue did, as you can see in the picture there. You can see Daniel chapter 2, 7, and 8. So a few different ways of saying basically the same thing. You have the Ancient of Days and Son of Man prophecy, which is one we're going to go over and one that I suggest you dig into. Then there's the a ram and a goat, and then a little horn, which a horn represents a king, a powerful figure. You have the 70 weeks of years, or 70 sevens of years, it's sometimes called, which is a very important prophecy, another one we're going to go over. Then you have a glorious one, then a prophecy about Persia and Greece, and then kings to the south and the north. So I'm only going to go over the two in red. The other ones I would suggest looking into if you're into prophecy and getting a good commentary for. But these two are definitely important, and they're the ones I want to go over because they deal with the Messiah. Um, some of the others kind of do too, but those ones especially. So now with the Ancient of Days and Son of Man, um, that's the best picture I could find that I think kind of describes it. It's not exactly how I picture it when I read it, but I think it's pretty close. So I'm going to read it real quick. As I kept watching, this is Daniel speaking, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was white like snow, and the hair of his head was like whitest wool. His throne was flaming fire, its wheels were blazing fire. A river of fire was flowing, coming out from his presence. Thousands upon thousands served him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was convened, and the books were opened. I watched then because of the sound of the arrogant words, the horn, the little horn from before, or the little horn that's from the beast's prophecy. Anyway, the arrogant words the horn was speaking. As I continued watching, the beast was killed and its body destroyed and given over to the burning fire. As for the rest of the beasts, their authority to rule was removed, but an extension of life was granted to them for a certain period of time. I continued watching in the night visions, and I saw one like a son of man coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was escorted before him. He was given authority to rule, and glory, and a kingdom, so that those of every people, nation, and language should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will not be destroyed. So, if you read the other prophecies, you'll make a little more sense of the beasts being slain and extension of life and that kind of thing. So here, the Ancient of Days obviously refers to Yahweh. And it's not that he has age or that he looks old, but it's, it did describe him with white hair, so I guess he kind of looks old. But the Ancient of Days title is really about God's existence before there was even time, at least as far as we're concerned. And, his eternality, basically. The Son of Man is a reference to the Messiah. And this is something that you can see in John 12:34 and Mark 14:61 to 64. The Mark passage is where Jesus applies this to himself. Jesus often used Son of Man as himself to refer to himself, and this prophecy is where he gets that from. It shouldn't be confused with the phrase in the book of Ezekiel, where you know God or an angel refers to Ezekiel by saying, "You Son of Man," because that just means human, and here it's talking about one who looks like the Son of Man. And when Jesus uses it, he's referring it to himself as the Son of Man. It's obviously a reference to Daniel. Now, between the prophecy in the earlier part of this chapter, as well as in chapter 2, with the statue and the kingdoms, and then also in the 70 sevens prophecy that we're going to get to in a second, it's pretty clear when the Messiah is going to come. And the 77s makes that extremely clear. And so we can point that, I was just looking at interpretations and calculations and stuff on your own. We can see that it most definitely was Jesus of Nazareth who was called the Christ. And since his kingdom was an everlasting kingdom, and since the kingdom was not of this world, I believe that the church is the representation of God's kingdom on this planet, and therefore the true kingdom has never ceased to exist from the time of Jesus until now. Um, yes, it's had to be, we've gotten a little off course and we've had to come back, but we've never gotten so far off course that we could be called not the Church of Christ, the church that Christ set up. Of course, there are churches that claim to be the church that Christ set up from ancient times and from more recent times. The Mormons, for example, believe that Joseph Smith had to re-establish the church and renew the gospel, the restoration of the gospel, as I believe what they call that. But I think that goes against what Daniel says here, and it goes against what Christ said about his church, about the gates of hell never prevailing against it, and his word never going away, because they believe that the Bible is corrupt. They still use it to a degree, but Joseph Smith had a translation. I don't think he finished it or got anywhere close to finishing his translation of the Bible, which really, in my mind, wasn't a translation because he wasn't looking at the originals, and he added in a whole bunch of stuff. I don't think he took anything out, but I know he added a lot in. So, with that, I want to get to the 70 weeks or 77s prophecy. There's a couple different ways to look at it. I'm not sure which one I like best at the moment. And even then, there's probably a third, and there's probably many, many ways to look at it. Some look at it, because it is kind of broken down in the book of Daniel a little bit. It was going to start with an edict that said, go ahead and rebuild Jerusalem. And I think there were a few of those in a few different years, so kind of picking which one is a little tricky. But basically, from after Darius, about the time of Artaxerxes, that's when they started rebuilding. That's when the time scale goes to. You can see this first picture here has the 70 weeks ending in AD 34, which is a possibility. This next one has there being one more week, so 7 more years, that's in the future, and there's a gap. And that one, I'm not sure if I like that interpretation or not. If anything, I would think there's only 3.5 years left, but I'm not positive. and it's something that I will probably dive into, but it's really not, this is a 101 kind of study, and I don't want to get too deep into these things. But I want you to be aware that there is a prophecy that we can use to date with extreme precision the coming of the time of the Messiah. And I just want to read that little section to you. So this is Daniel chapter 9, starting in verse 24. 70 weeks are decreed about your people and your holy city, to bring the rebellion to an end, to put a stop to sin, to wipe away injustice, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. Know and understand this: from the issuing of the decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. So that's 69 weeks total so far. It will be rebuilt with a plaza and a moat, but in difficult times. After those 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off and will have nothing. The people of the coming prince will destroy the city and the sanctuary. The end will come with a flood, and until the end there will be war. Desolations are desolations are decreed. He will make a firm covenant with many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week he will put a stop to sacrifice and offering. And the abomination of desolation will be on a wing of the temple until the decreed destruction is poured out on the desolator. So what we have here, if each week represents 7 years, then there are 7 weeks, 49 years, as this picture shows, where they'll be rebuilding Jerusalem. And it takes about 49 years to do that. Then there's the 434 years from the finishing of that to when the Messiah comes. Then it says the last week is all about the Messiah, right? And in the middle of the week, starting in verse 27, he will make a firm covenant with many for 1 week. But in the middle of the week, he will put a stop to sacrifice and offering. Now, if Jesus' ministry started when he was about 30, and he was going to be crucified when he was about 33, which is what we typically believe. Maybe his ministry was 3.5 years long. And we know, by looking at the Gospels, that when he died on the cross, there was an earthquake, a solar eclipse for a few hours. The curtain in the Holy of Holies ripped apart. So everyone could now see the Holy of Holies, and basically that was symbolically showing that everyone has access to God now. And of course we look at the book of Hebrews, and it talks about how the old covenant with the animal sacrifices didn't really do any good. It was, trusting in God did good, but the animal sacrifices themselves did not. And while animal sacrifice may not have physically stopped at the time of Christ's death, it definitely did stop in the sense of that being the covenant. That's when the old covenant ended, new covenant was made. Now, the last half of that week, the last 3.5 years, I don't know that would have happened after the resurrection. But then all the other years, were pretty well lined up. So what's up with that last half a week? Especially since it wasn't until AD 70 that the Romans came in and destroyed the temple again, destroyed Jerusalem for that matter. Um, so I don't think the full week is in the future. I think the last half of the week is in the future. Exactly when it's going to start, how it's going to start, I don't know. And that's the thing about prophecy, apocalyptic literature. It's hard to read, it's hard to understand, it's hard to interpret. So, but that is the end of this slideshow. I didn't add a slide with what we're going to go over next week, but it will be parts of Isaiah and Jeremiah, um, specifically showing prophecies about the Messiah and why Jesus is that Messiah. Then after that, we will go into the New Testament, and we'll talk for probably maybe 2 or 3 sessions about the Gospels, um, and I'll be harmonizing them. That is, Matthew tells this story in this one, and Mark tells it, a little later, and because they tell it at different times, but they have different reasonings for doing that. It's not that they're being ingenuous or forgot or whatever, but I'll explain more about that here in a couple of weeks, or no, here in about a month, because we're going to go over Isaiah and Jeremiah next, and then the Gospels after that. So until then, God bless. Please feel free to like and subscribe, and go to my website, brianediger.com, and contact me through there with any questions you may have or any advice for doing these live streams. And I will talk to you later.